Now we're going to talk about early childhood cognitive development. I never teach my pupils, I only provide the conditions in which they can learn. Albert Einstein. So let's talk about how children learn. Well, when we talk about cognitive development, first we have to talk about Piaget. We are still in his stage of pre-operational thought. So this stage is characterized by the use of symbols to represent objects and relationships. Remember, language is a symbolic activity. So symbolic play, this is pretend play. Pretend play starts in the toddler years, but remember they are performing activities that are familiar to them. Children in this stage play by copying. They mimic actions, push a car around, feed a doll, etc. In early childhood, preschoolers can now pretend that car and doll are something else entirely. Around age 3, children can imbue the object they're playing with characteristics and actions. For example, the doll is now feeding herself. We also start to see imaginary friends. They're part of this symbolic imaginary play, and they're perfectly normal. They help children practice relationships, help them work through scenarios. Imaginary friends can help them get better with their real friends, and then they fade away when they're no longer needed. There's no reason to worry about a child having an imaginary friend. They're perfectly normal and perfectly healthy. Magical thinking is still in full swing. This leads to rich, imaginative play. Don't be too fast to burst the bubble. It's really fun watching preschoolers play and seeing what their minds can come up with. So this is pre-operational thought. What does Piaget mean by operations? Well, the definition of operations are flexible, reversible, mental manipulations of objects, in which objects can be mentally transformed and returned to their original state. Okay, so it's transforming objects mentally. Piaget called these processes operations, and since preschool children can't follow the logic behind them, he called this the pre-operational thought stage. So some operations are planning, flexibility, reversibility, and conservation. So for example, planning a move in checkers, you have to picture the result of your move. Maybe you're considering several different moves at the same time. That's flexibility. Picturing how the board will look after a move, then returning your focus to the way the board looks now, that's reversibility. Conservation is the idea that something remains the same even though it looks different. So preschoolers still have very little logic. They don't grasp reversibility. Pour liquid into one container and back out. They don't understand that that keeps the same amount of liquid no matter what. If you think about it, reversibility is critical for school skills like math, and able to understand things like if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then 4 minus 2 has to equal 2. That's reversibility. So children in this stage have little to no understanding of conservation, and we'll talk about that more later. So egocentrism, toddlers had that, preschoolers still have it even though it's starting to fade. This is not understanding that different people have different perspectives of the world. Remember, if I know something, everyone knows it. Pre-operational children answer questions from an egocentric perspective. They explain things they do because they wanted to do it or because mommy wanted to do it. And they extend that to inanimate objects, such as why does the sun shine? Because it wants to, or because I want it to make me warm, or maybe the sun sets because it's tired, or so I can go to sleep. So they answer questions still with themselves at the center of their thoughts. Part of this is visual perspective taking. This is, can you imagine the literal viewpoint of others? Can you see in your mind's eye what other people are seeing? You need to know this to know that you have to turn something around so someone else can see it. If someone is in another room, you can't ask, what is this? Because they don't know what this is. They can't see it. So it's putting yourself in another person's position and imagining what they see. Preschoolers can't do this because they're too egocentric. They still think that what they see, everyone sees. So in order to test this, Piaget had something called the 3-mountain test. It was used to show whether children have visual perspective taking or not. I have a video here for you to watch to see what it looks like. Essentially, it just gives the child one thing to look at and puts a toy in a place where it would see something else. You then ask the child what the toy would see. An egocentric child will answer with what they can see, thinking that if they can see it, everyone can. So this experiment showed that preschoolers cannot take on the viewpoint of another. They lack visual perspective taking. Pre-causal thinking is a big hallmark of this stage. This just means they don't have a full grasp of cause and effect. Here are some reasons. So transductive reasoning is going from one isolated event to another, whether or not they have anything in common. I should go to sleep because it's dark outside. Okay. Another thing is animism and artificialism. We've talked about animism, that's giving inanimate objects feelings and intentions, pretending they're alive. Artificialism is the idea that environmental features are made by people. For example, if you ask a child, why is the sky blue? They might say, because someone painted it blue. That's artificialism. And again, magical thinking causes them to draw causal conclusions from unrelated events. They might decide that two things are related to each other even if they're not. That's part of magical thinking. So it's not the logical cause and effect. In this stage, they also have a confusion of the mental and the physical. So what happens in their mind and what happens in real life are hard for them to distinguish. So some aspects of this is they may believe their dreams are real. They think their dreams really happened. They don't fully understand that things can happen only in their minds without them being real. They think that their thoughts reflect reality. Same thing, they believe that because they are thinking something, it must be real. This can lead to really great imaginary play, or it could lead to scary monsters in the closet. They don't recognize that words are arbitrary. Young children will argue with you about word choice. Words are symbols. Any sound could refer to anything, and people can use different words to refer to the same thing. But young children have a hard time with that. They think that every object has to have one word to describe it, and they will argue about the right word to use in the right situation. Appearance-reality distinction. Piaget said children can't differentiate between real and mental events until around ages 7 or 8. But more recent studies show this ability starts to emerge in the preschool years. So at age 3, they can tell the difference between a real object and a toy object. They can tell the difference between the picture of an object and the real object. And they know the difference between pretend actions and real actions. By age 4, they have a clear distinction between real items and imagined items. So we see this appearance-reality distinction evolve over the course of the preschool years. Pre-operational children still struggle with mental representations, the mental forms that a real object can take, which may differ from one another. They have trouble understanding that a real object can take many forms in our minds. For example, children were shown a pencil eraser that looked like a cookie. Before knowing what it was, they said it looked like a cookie. After being told it was an eraser and then asked again, what does this look like? They said it looked like an eraser. They could not mentally represent the eraser as being both an eraser and looking like a cookie at the same time. So Piaget came up with these conservation tasks. So remember, conservation is understanding that something remains the same even if it looks different. So Piaget came up with tests to see if children understood it in many properties. Some of those properties are volume. So like a container of water, you pour it from one container into another, it's still the same amount of water even though it may look different. That's conservation of volume. Conservation of number is if you take a certain number of objects and rearrange them so that they look different, it's still the same number. Conservation of mass might be if you take a ball of Play-Doh and squish it into a different shape. It's still the same amount of Play-Doh even though it looks different. Conservation of length, if you pick something up and move it to a new location, it still has the same length. There are other aspects or other properties that have conservation, but I wanted to just show you some of the tests in action. So please pause this lecture and watch this video to see how a 3-year-old does on Piaget's conservation tasks. So why did he fail at those tasks? Why was he so bad at them? Well, preschoolers tend to only focus on one dimension at a time. This is called centration. They can focus on only one property of something at the same time, and they lack reversibility. So when they look at like the volume experiment, they're only focusing on the height of the water in the glass, not the size of the glass. And they can't do the reversibility in their head to say, well, if I poured that water back into the original glass, it would still be the same amount. So because of this centration and lack of reversibility, that leads them to make these conservation mistakes. They also have a lack of something called class inclusion, which is understanding that things can be more than one thing at the same time, belonging to a class. For example, a dog is also a mammal. So we just see in their thinking over and over again that they really only focus on one aspect of a situation at a time. They can't focus on both the length and the number of the row of quarters. You have to draw their attention to one, and once you draw their attention to their number, they can't focus on the length anymore. So those are his famous conservation tasks, and if you have a preschooler in your life, it's really fun to perform those tasks on the preschooler. So some criticisms of Piaget. The nature of the test versus the ability of the child. Later researchers found that when they designed experiments to test some of these notions in different ways, children were able to succeed at them. Therefore, maybe it was the test itself that was getting a certain answer rather than the child's understanding. So maybe it was the way he worded the test or the way he structured the test. A lot of his tests language played a big role. And children, if they don't understand a question because they lack the language skills, they might give the wrong answer. So since a lot of Piaget's tests involved questions from the researcher and a verbal answer from the child, if the child lacked language skills, he or she may have answered incorrectly, or maybe the question was asked in such a way to lead them to a certain answer. And his idea of causality, remember he said they lacked cause and effect. Newer research shows that children understand causality more than Piaget gave them credit for. Piaget used very open-ended questions. For example, he would say, where did the ocean come from? But when asked those questions more directly, for example, did people make the ocean? Children tend to answer correctly. So maybe it was the nature of his tests that got certain answers rather than children's understanding. We will continue this in the next video.